Hello, everybody. Welcome to a new episode of the Dissenter. I'm your host, Ricardo Lopes, as always. And today I have the immense pleasure of being here with Dr. David Sloan Wilson. He is SUNY Distinguished Professor of Biology and Anthropology at Binghamton University. He applies evolutionary theory to all aspects of humanity in addition to the rest of life, both in his own research and as director of the Evolution Institute. His books include Darwin's Cathedral, Evolution, Religion, and the Nature of Society, Evolution for Everyone, How Darwin's Theory Can Change the Way We Think About Our Lives, Does Altruism Exist? Culture, Genes, and the Welfare of Others, and also a recently edited book, Evolution and Contextual Behavioral Science. So, Dr. Sloan Wilson, thank you a lot for taking the time to come on the show. It's a real pleasure to everyone.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Okay, so the first question I would like to ask you, because I would like to focus at least the first part of our conversation on your latest book, as I said, Evolution and Contextual Behavioral Science. Even the title refers to that on the one hand you refer to evolution, evolutionary theory, evolutionary processes, and more generally evolutionary behavioral sciences. But on the other hand, you also refer to what you call contextual behavioral science. So could you please tell us what exactly is contextual behavioral science and perhaps some of the main differences between that and the more evolutionary approaches?
Sure. And my co-author on that book is Stephen C. Hayes, who is very well known in his own circle. And I'll tell more about that soon. So contextual behavioral science is a relatively new term. It refers to the study of behavior in the context of everyday life. And so right away you can see the evolutionary connections. It has long roots. It goes back to the philosophical tradition of pragmatism and figures such as William James and John Dewey and B.F. Skinner. And so, and pragmatism was itself informed by evolutionary theory. And so there's deep evolutionary connections, but you have to understand the complex history of psychology, basically. And I know that we're going to be dwelling on that in this interview. So I could actually just begin, is that if you go back to the late 19th century and early 20th century, then all of the tools that we have to study the mind and the brain did not exist. And so there was rampant introspection, basically. And against that background, the behaviorism as a school of thought was highly scientific, because it had more or less avoided what at that time was impossible, to study the internal mechanisms of the mind, and then studied behavior as an input-output relation. We can look at the environment, we can look at the behavioral output. And so behaviorism was rigorous science at that time, became a dominant tradition in psychology up until the middle of the 20th century, but then was rejected in some sense by what was called the cognitive revolution. And the cognitive revolution was in turn critiqued by something called evolutionary psychology. All of this was in academic psychology. Behaviorism didn't go away. It thrived in the applied behavioral sciences because it was so useful. The fact is that we do respond to our environments. If you want to change behavior in a practical sense, then you need behaviorism. Behaviorism was complemented by cognitive psychology. So in therapy, we call it behavioral and cognitive therapy. That's now added a mindfulness-based layer. All of that is in the applied wing. And so we have this division between basic psychology and applied psychology. And then if we go to from the individual level to the population level, we have such things as public health, epidemiology, and something called prevention science, which I'll bet most of your readers have never heard of. But these are all disciplines, academic disciplines, that are applied in nature. And so what they do is they study behavior in the context of everyday life with the aim of influencing it in addition to just plain understanding it. And so the subtitle of my book with Steve is, it has a long subtitle that even I don't remember, but it ends with understanding, predicting, and influencing behavior. So contextual behavioral science is this whole applied wing of the behavioral sciences, which has been disconnected from academic psychology to a remarkable degree. And despite having deep roots, evolutionary roots, it has not been connected to evolutionary science for a long time. And so now what we're doing is we're reunifying those traditions. An earlier draft of the title was the reunification. So evolution and contextual behavioral science, a reunification. So there's a big conceptual project there. This is a big task of integration, and at the same time, it has this goal of influencing behavior.
Okay, so I would also like to ask you a little bit more to clarify some aspects regarding our innate and environmental influences, what influences our behavior in general. But since you've already alluded to the history of psychology, I would like also to ask you right now at this point if really B.F. Skinner is a controversial figure in psychology, and perhaps we are not really fair, or at least psychologists in general not really fair when they talk about his work and behaviorism, because it is also true that, for example, he also acknowledged the importance of evolution and Darwin's theory and evolutionary processes in general, and perhaps most of the time when people or mainstream psychologists talk about his work, they really dismiss all of that and only focus on the aspects that are more strictly related to some of the phenomena that he uncovered in behaviorism, let's say.
Right. And I think it's important to acknowledge that every important school of thought has both a baby and a bathwater. There's something that they're grasping which is true and deserves to be retained. And then there's other things which really do need to be discarded. And we need to find the baby in the bathwater in all of these schools of thought that we're talking about. And the baby in behaviorism, which includes but is by no means restricted to Skinner, is that there's something about our open-ended capacity for learning which is like evolution. And just as evolution sifts genes, genetic evolution sifts genes, then most species are structured to sift behaviors on the basis of their consequences. And so Skinner had this phrase, selection by consequences, in a famous paper he wrote in 1981, kind of summarizing the essence of his school of thought, which is that there's this way of thinking which is best developed in evolutionary biology, and we call it adaptationist thinking or natural selection thinking. Basically, when we begin to study a species, we ask the simple question, how would this species be structured to survive and reproduce in its environment? And that provides just a good guess, basically, a good initial guess, which might or might not be true. It could be wrong in many ways, but nevertheless, you might say it's the most important tool in the Darwinian toolkit, natural selection thinking. And what Skinner understood was that that same way of thinking could be applied to our behaviors, in which the history, the evolutionary process, was not genetic evolution, other than genetic evolution creating the whole infrastructure for open-ended behavioral change. It was the history of reinforcement. So if you want to know what a rat does in a Skinner box, you look to the history of reinforcement. And that would be an evolutionary process, which then is extended cross-generationally to cultural change. So we can think of an individual as an evolving system in its own right, and cultures as evolving systems in their own right, using the same adaptationist way of thinking as genetic evolution. That is the main baby in the Skinnerian bathwater. And of course, it is being pursued, I think, by cultural evolution. So, but you have to remember that this gets back into history. That why is it that the modern study of cultural evolution by evolutionary biologists only dates back to about the 1970s? That's when pioneers such as Pete Litcherson and Rob Boyd and Marcus Feldman and E.O. Wilson, Charles Lumsden, 1970s. Where was cultural evolution for most of the 20th century? Why did evolutionary biology become so gene-centric, as if the only way that offspring can resemble their parents is by sharing genes? And so we really have to, baby and bathwater on both sides. So as far as the history of evolutionary biology is concerned, the baby is good for us. We learned a lot about genetic evolution. The bathwater is, where the hell were the other evolutionary processes that we're now talking about? Epigenetics, social learning, symbolic thought. These are new for evolutionary biologists. But of course, they're not new for other branches of knowledge. We have been studying such things as symbolic thought for a long time, but not from an evolutionary perspective. And so there's this huge task of integration that needs to go beyond what we currently think of as the biological sciences. And that's what's at play, basically. That's what we're here to talk about.
Mm-hmm. Right. Okay, so let's get now a little bit more specific, because as far as I understand, and of course I've already had a lot of evolutionary psychologists on the show, basically what evolutionary theory does when applied to human behavior, as far as I understand it, is that it tells us how we evolved some cognitive mechanisms to deal with evolutionarily relevant problems and to solve them, particularly the ones related to survival and reproduction. At least these are the main ones. But when talking about contextual behavioral science and perhaps learning mechanisms and symbolism and other things that you referred to, what are you trying to do here? Are you trying to imply that perhaps those processes expand some of these innate cognitive mechanisms that we've evolved, or that perhaps they render them more flexible, or perhaps when we are exposed to environments that weren't really part of our evolutionary history, that those mechanisms allow for us to develop new ones that were not really available to our ancestors, for example.
Right. So to continue telling this broad intellectual history, one thing I do when I talk about evolution, I want to get the basic topic across as fast as possible. I rely on Nico Tinbergen and his 4 questions that will be familiar to you and some of your readers. What Tinbergen wisely said was that all products of evolution need to be addressed in 4 ways concerning their function, mechanism, development, and history, phylogenetic history. And so a fully rounded 4-question approach is what I think of as an evolutionary approach. And against that background, then Skinner behaviorism can be faulted I talked about the baby. The baby was basically a functionalist baby. Tinbergen was asking the function question, and the evolutionary process was taking place within the lifetime of the individual. Tinbergen was not asking mechanism questions. And in fact, he disparaged the whole idea of studying mechanisms. He called it mentalism. And so that was part of the a deficiency of behaviorism. When behaviorism was replaced by cognitive psychology, this signaled basically more attention to mechanism. We need to know the mechanism. But the cognitive revolutionists thought of the brain as like a single all-purpose computer. That was their central metaphor. And it's against that background that evolutionary psychologists such as Leda Cosmides and John Tooby and those folks made an excellent point, which is that the mind is not a single computer. The mind is a collection of special purpose computers solving separate problems of adaptation and of survival and reproduction. So there's the baby in the evolutionary psychology bathwater. Unfortunately, they made a polarizing distinction between evolutionary psychology and what they called the standard social science model, which was behaviorism. It was the blank slate. It was the idea that cultures can do anything and individuals can do anything. This was said to be just plain wrong. And so Skinner and much else, the whole concept of human nature as open-ended, capable of becoming something different in the future than in the past, was excluded from this particular version of evolutionary psychology, which became like a jukebox, was one of the metaphors, basically, that the mind is like a jukebox with all these records that have been pre-cut by genetic evolution, and all the environment does is push buttons, and out come these genetically evolved modules. And so this was, in the first place, an excellent point. There's something true about this. And in the second place, like severely partial, leading out the whole open-ended component of human nature in its extreme form. And it's for that reason that evolutionary psychology has created such problems for itself. There's all kinds of smart people who are studying the human mind from an evolutionary perspective who do not call themselves evolutionary psychologists, wouldn't even dream of calling themselves evolutionary psychologists. I begin an article where I forget which one because I do too much writing, but I was at a symposium on language from an evolutionary perspective, and in the Q&A, it was a big panel of experts up on the stage. And in a Q&A, someone in the audience asked about evolutionary psychology, and everyone on the panel, other than myself, rolled their eyes and then proceeded to distance themselves from evolutionary psychology. And I was thinking to myself, well, I understand why this is, but most people in the audience must really be wondering how everyone up here on the stage could be talking about language from an evolutionary perspective and then not calling themselves evolutionary psychologists. So that was the bathwater of evolutionary psychologists. And the solution to this, I think, is really easy in retrospect. And it is to use the immune system as a model, basically, for thinking about our behavioral system. And I'll go through this fast, but basically, we know a lot about the immune system, and we know it's elaborately complex. We know that it's, of course, a product of genetic evolution. We know that it's densely modular. We also know that it has what's called an innate component and an adaptive component. The innate component basically stays the same through the lifetime of the individual. It does most of the work of the immune system, but it does not change within the lifetime of the organism. The adaptive component is also innate and densely modular, but what it does is to create 100 million antibodies, which are then selected according to their ability to bind to antigens. The point being is that with the immune system, we can talk about massive modularity without denying an open-ended evolutionary component. We can have both. And so also can we have both for the human behavioral system. So that is what we're reaching for. That is what's actually easy to comprehend in retrospect. But what it requires is a reunification of evolutionary psychology and the so-called standard social science model. That is what we're striving for in the book.
Mm-hmm. Okay. So, going back to the modularist approach to the human mind, the massive modularity of the human mind as evolutionary psychologists propose, or at least most of them, I think. I want to ask you about this because, in fact, I've had Dr. Cosmides on the show, and I've really asked her about this because, I mean, I think that perhaps some people have a wrong view of this proposal, in the sense that since they are proposing that we have cognitive mechanisms operating in our minds that evolved as a result of having them dealing with each specific evolutionary relevant problem. That is, they are not domain general, they are domain specific. Each of them is directed towards solving a very specific problem, but there's this thing. But on the other hand, I also talked with her about the notion of them being encapsulated, as some people like the philosopher Jerry Fodor put forth, but perhaps 30 years ago or something like that, and they don't really being able to communicate with one another. But Dr. Cosmides told me that that was really misleading, and that was not really what she and her husband John Tooby and others were saying. She told me that in fact the modules that they consider are able to communicate with one another. So I would like to ask you if this is what you were criticizing, or perhaps that you were criticizing the fact that they exclude from the picture completely the possibility of us having some open-ended general domain modules.
Well, I mean, I go way back with these folks. I hosted the annual meeting of the Evolution and Human Behavior Society in 1993, which was 1 year after The Adapted Mind came out. That featured Lita and John. There was a session. I wrote a critique of evolutionary psychology that was published in 1994. And I've always said I've had a love-hate relationship with evolutionary psychology. I love it and I hate it. And I think that Lita and John did a great job promoting a new school of thought. There was some empire building going on there. Like there's a right way and a wrong way. And the polarization of the SSSM and basically the exclusion of people like Skinner and Clifford Geertz and this whole wing of social constructivism, basically, as something which is a theoretical possibility. There cannot be a mechanism that is open-ended. It's right there in their writing. So, I mean, so to say that they were misunderstood is, I think, a bit disingenuous. And yet at the same time, if I want to turn on the love part of evolutionary psychology, then I think that in the first place, all things change and mature. And as things go, this is, well, I want to say rather fast, but because I am an insider, you could look at such things as a society, such as the Human Behavior and Evolution Society, and its different elements. And for example, the element of evolutionary psychology compared to the element of cultural evolution, Richardson, Boyd, and all that. And you can see that they're quite a bit like oil and water, not mixing within the society, or taking 10, 20 years to mix. So I would say actually now they're becoming mixed. So probably what we should do is not focus too much on the past. Let's focus on the present and future. And I think more and more we're basically converging on what we already know about the immune system. Yes, it's innate, it's modular, but that does not mean that it. And let me make it concrete with an example from the chapter, from the book. There's a really interesting pairing, and this also brings in the theme of development, which I know that you want to bring in, and so Bruce Ellis is one of the premier evolutionary developmental psychologists. And his history is interesting because he was there at the ground floor. He was a graduate student, I believe, in the 1990s. I forget who his advisor was. But he looked at evolutionary psychology and he asked, where's development? And he couldn't find it because it just seemed like these modules were just, we were born with them and then they get triggered by the environment. Where's the role of development in evolutionary psychology? And so he, along with others like David Bjorklund, and were pioneers of evolutionary developmental psychology. And where that stands now is, among other things, this distinction between fast and slow life history strategies. So the idea is that we're phenotypically plastic. Many species, including ourselves, are phenotypically plastic. We're adapted to a range of environments. Yes, there's environmental signals that trigger the right adaptations. In harsh environments, that calls for a suite of life history traits that we call a fast life history strategy, early reproduction, risky behavior, stuff like that. In safe and secure environments, we develop a slow life history strategy, and this is triggered to a degree. And that tells us a lot about adolescent behavior, risky adolescent behavior. I held a workshop with Bruce, which resulted in a key article on risky adolescent behavior from an evolutionary perspective. Tells you a lot about bullying, a lot about early reproduction, all kinds of stuff. And so Bruce's chapter in my book with Steve was all about that. Well, that's great stuff and very new to people on the contextual behavioral science end of things. But on their side, they're actually working with people. And because therapists and typically work with people that are experiencing problems, they spend less time with people on the slow life history end of the continuum and more time with the kids that are having problems. And it's at that point that you have to ask the question, what do we do? I mean, what can we do? We have to do something in the lifetime of these kids in order to help them. It's not helpful to say, oh, you have a fast life history strategy because you had this, so on and so forth. We have to do something. And that involves working with their mental processes. And it's at that point that we begin to become Skinnerian. And also, not just, but here's another thing that Skinner got wrong. He tried to explain everything in terms of operant conditioning, and including such things as language and symbolic thought. As it turns out, that's not possible. Our capacity for symbolic thought needs additional psychological mechanisms. You can't explain it. And that's why rats and pigeons can't do it. And so the human capacity for symbolic thought is a different kettle of fish. And that is why behaviorist therapy needed to be supplemented by cognitive therapy and mindfulness-based therapies. Those are adding on the layers of symbolic thought. So now you can work with these kids at the level of behavior, cognitive, and mindfulness, and you could actually get them to change their phenotypes. You can get them to evolve. You can also get them to evolve by changing their environments. If you can provide the safe and secure environment, then maybe they'll adopt a slow life history strategy to a degree without needing to be taught. So but Bruce didn't really go there, or had not gone there. He was more or less operating in the fast versus slow life history space, and the contextual behavioral scientists, Joe Ciarocci and Louise Hayes and others, were operating in the kind of the Skinnerian space, and there was a lot of mutual interest in getting the whole picture. And so that's what's exciting about the reunification, about the whole book, is bringing the evolutionists together with the contextual behavioral scientists to explore this common ground.
Mm-hmm. Right. Okay, so you've already referred to evolutionary developmental psychology and biology, that is the so-called evo-devo approach. And you refer to life history theory, which is very interesting, because now I would like to ask you if, isn't it also the case that through principles of evolutionary theory, when applied to psychology, and in this case human psychology, that we also get from them approaches like the one referring to life history, in the sense that we can, at least to some degree, predict that when people are exposed to different environmental cues, then the same evolved innate mechanisms that they have will lead them through different life paths, or not?
Well, I think that if I understand your question correctly, in the first place, we're asking questions about phenotypic plasticity. Mm-hmm. And we can all agree that there is many mechanisms of phenotypic plasticity. At one end of a continuum, the organism is sensitive to cues very early in life, even before birth, and based on those cues, embarks upon a developmental trajectory that can be irreversible. So we get such things as predictive adaptive responses and interesting things like that. So flexibility that early in life, which then becomes less flexible later in life. Attachment styles, for example, you might develop an attachment style early in life, which might be difficult to change. At the other extreme, we have a chameleon-like ability to change at the moment, basically. To toggle back and forth between different behaviors at the moment, like a turtle pulling into its shell or coming out of its shell. So, and in any particular case, we don't really know unless we find out which mechanisms of phenotypic plasticity are operating. I'll give you an example. I had the opportunity to help design a school for at-risk students. Students that had flunked all their courses in the previous year were our students in this school. So they were definitely on the harsh environment end of things. Now we were going to provide a nurturing environment in the school. We could only alter the school environment. We couldn't alter the rest of their environment. And so the question, would they respond to our school environment? And the answer is there would be no way of knowing. It's perfectly possible that they were now set in stone based on their earlier lives, could not respond. That was a possibility. Or not. Maybe they could. I mean, you don't have to do the experiment. And as it turns out, they were very responsive. Not totally. We're not chameleons in every respect, but it's pretty amazing the degree to which you can take a kid that's had a hard life and put it in a nurturing environment, put that person in a nurturing environment, and that person will respond. That's a good thing to know. So there's all of that. And at the same time, I think we want to make the distinction between what's called closed and open forms of phenotypic plasticity. A closed form of phenotypic plasticity is that there's a number of strategies, A, B, C, D, E, and one of them gets invoked based on environmental cues. But the strategies don't change. You only got 5 or whatever, and you can only choose among those 5. Okay, so that is closed phenotypic plasticity. Open phenotypic plasticity is a variation and selection process. The organism behaves every which way, and then there's mechanisms to select some of those behaviors. That is more open-ended. That can create behaviors which never before existed in the history of the species, because it is an open-ended evolutionary process. It is a form of phenotypic plasticity. It evolved by genetic evolution. It is very modular in its own way. You know, if you look at the mechanisms of genetic heritability, it's very modular. It's massively modular, but it still allows open-ended variation and selection. And so we have all of these different kinds of phenotypic plasticity, open, closed, operating early in life, continuing to operate later in life. It's very complicated, and yet at the same time, pretty easy to understand. I just said it. And so, you know, not so hard, but of course, a lot of hard work required to find out what's operating in any particular situation.
Mm-hmm. Okay. So, I mean, you probably already answered this question throughout the entire interview until now, but anyway, what would you say are perhaps the main reasons why we have to have an extended evolutionary synthesis? Because, I mean, what are the main points where our modern evolutionary synthesis falls short in terms of explaining some evolutionary processes and in this case applying it specifically to the behavioral sciences?
Right. So the extended evolutionary synthesis. Yes, I was one of the original Altenberg 16. So the history of this is that Massimo Puglisi, who is both a philosopher and an evolutionary biologist, worked with the Konrad Lorenz Institute to on a workshop. It was just a workshop, but he called it the extended evolutionary synthesis. And then that got picked up by Susan Mazur, I think, and as if this was some kind of conspiracy or something. And got much more press than it deserved. It was just a workshop. And yet something very interesting is going on here, having to do with such things as paradigms and field changing. And I mean, the very labeling that we do. Why do we call something a new synthesis? Scientific change is kind of continuous. When we call it a synthesis or a paradigm, we want to set some kind of milestone, basically. And so the modern synthesis was a milestone. And it was like a consolidation of some insights. I think all syntheses capture some things and leave other things out. And so the modern synthesis captured Mendelian genetics and its consequences, and left all kinds of things out, left cultural evolution out, left out the Baldwin effect, the idea that behavior leads evolution. Basically, the idea that behavioral learning leads genetic evolution, proposed by James Mark Baldwin in the early 20th century, regarded as very important at the time. Totally left out of the modern synthesis. Development, left out. of the modern synthesis. Why do you need development when you can just basically look at genotypes and phenotypes? The fact that development is needed for phenotypes for genotypes to turn into phenotype, well, that's just a detail. As long as you know the phenotypic variation and there's some connection to genetic variation, you can say what you need to say. So the idea that evolutionary theory has gone beyond that enough so that we can set down another milestone, basically, is contested. And the thing that amuses me about the term, the extended evolutionary synthesis, is how modest it is. It doesn't even try to call itself a new synthesis. It's just meekly trying to say, can we say that we've extended the evolutionary synthesis? And the conservatives in the field say, no, how dare you call it the extended evolutionary synthesis? So it becomes this contested term. Well, I'm here to say that all kinds of stuff has changed. I mean, I think it should be a new synthesis. That's how much has changed. Development came back in. It was called evo-devo, but it's kind of astonishing that Tinbergen in 1963 could include development among his 4 questions, and yet in the 1970s, the term evo-devo and that trend could become strong enough. So now only then are we really, is evolution, is development being considered seriously from what happened before then? Well, really, it was an imbalance of the Tinbergen's 4 questions. When something is not evolutionary and yet it's scientific, what that means is that there's an imbalance. And typically, there's most of the attention is at mechanism. The mechanistic branches of biology, molecular biology and developmental biology before it became evo-devo, was all about just, how does this work in material terms? But to combine that with the functional end and so on and so forth is what's happening there. And so many things are associated with the extended evolutionary synthesis. I don't even know where to begin. It's the Lamarckian processes. That's part of it. Of course, the idea that we're going to go back to basics and we're going to study evolution in terms of variation, selection, and heredity, not just genes, multiple inheritance mechanisms. Jablonski and Lamb's wonderful book, Evolution in 4 Dimensions. And so it goes on and on. I think that, we are really in a very exciting time as far as evolutionary thought is concerned. And of course, most of all in relation to human affairs. A lot of the extended evolutionary synthesis doesn't even get to humans. But when you get to humans, then that is where, as I like to put it, completing the Darwinian revolution is now taking place. What took place in biology in the 20th century is now taking place for all things associated with humanity.
Mm-hmm. And it's very interesting that at a certain point there you refer to Lamarckian processes. So would you say that perhaps one of the reasons why people don't really accept, at least in the mainstream, these new ideas and, for example, things that come from epigenetics, for example, that you also want to include in the extended evolutionary synthesis? Is it because some of them really seem to go against the standard Darwinian evolutionary processes as we have them?
Well, what we call Darwinian was not Darwinian. It emerged later on as part of the modern synthesis. It owes more to Weismann than Darwin. Darwin was Lamarckian. Any good scholar will tell you that. Jablonka and Lamb, in their book Evolution in 4 Dimensions, have a really nice, concise history of all of this. And so The reason that Lamarckism is so contested, it's very interesting and deep, and we never get away from our cultural predilections. I think that's an important thing to say. I recently read an article by Jonathan Marks, who is often regarded as like a critic of evolutionary theory, but no, he's just a really good scholar of evolutionary history. I'll give you the reference for your readers, but he makes a key distinction between ancestry and emergence, and of course both of those are part of the evolutionary process. On the one hand, we can explain the way we are in terms of our ancestors, including our most closely related species. In some ways we are like chimps because we are great apes. That is our ancestry. Ancestry doesn't change. So when you focus on the ancestry part of evolution, you focus on the unchanging aspects of evolution. Yet, evolution is also about emergence. It's about things becoming different in the future than in the past. And so if you focus on the emergence end, then then you're focusing on change. Unsurprisingly, I think, in retrospect, if you look at the controversy over so-called Darwinian processes and Lamarckian processes, people, basically this would be like the conservative and progressive elements of culture would focus on these different aspects of evolution. And so those that were like against Lamarckism, in some ways were against progressivism, cultural progressivism. It would fall out that way. And a good historian of science would be able to document that. So I think that when what ended up as part of the modern synthesis was like a dogma. This is like one of the strongest dogmas of the modern synthesis, is that evolution cannot be directed, is not and cannot have a direction. Variation is always not random, strictly speaking, but arbitrary with respect to what is selected. It is only the environment that does the selecting. And the idea that evolution might have a direction, there's a real sacred cow there. I mean, a lot of evolutionary thinkers have been, they just cannot go there. That is just too daring for them to think about. And yet, you cannot think about cultural evolution, and you can't think about individual learning without those having directed components. Yes, they are evolutionary processes, and yes, they have a directed component. And as soon as we think about learning as the leading edge of genetic evolution, the Baldwin effect, and cultural evolution, which of course has an intentional component, then the idea that evolution can be partially directed, although still has a random component, becomes like central. And the only way that dogma could ever have arisen was by, in the first place, evolutionists narrowing their domain of activity to genetic evolution, leaving out the Baldwin effect. That's the only way that this dogma that evolution is always undirected could have ever become established, was by evolutionary biology becoming gene-centric. So at the same time that we're criticizing other traditions, such as behaviorism or social constructivism and all of that, let's criticize evolutionary biologists for becoming so shrunken in their views on evolution. That's what's opening up now.
Mm-hmm. Right. Okay, so now let's move to a very specific topic of your work, because I think this is again a very contentious topic, unfortunately, when it comes to science and evolutionarily minded people, let's say. that is religion. And you wrote your book, Darwin's Cathedral, that deals a lot with this, and you also have a very interesting series of articles that were published in Huffington Post called Atheism as a Stealth Religion. And I mean, I've already had people on the show with whom I talked about this, and it really is frustrating, because it seems to me that particularly people that are associated with the new atheism movement, they don't seem to be able to deal with religion as a natural phenomenon. And it seems to me that they also make a lot of assumptions through which they accuse religion and religious people of certain practices, and they don't notice that they themselves also fall under those problems. Like, for example, they accuse religion of being a mechanism to promote coalitional psychology and fostering conflict between different groups. But it seems to me that many of the ideas that they put on the table also stem from coalitional psychology, in this case of them being the scientifically minded people, the evolutionists, against the religious people, who in this case they are against because historically there have been some religious groups that opposed evolution and evolutionary theory. So what would you like to say about that?
I think we might want to schedule another hour for it, which I would be happy to do, but I'll give you just a taste. And this denial, basically, of religion as a social construction. First of all, amongst the scientists and the atheists, I'm an atheist. No supernaturalism anywhere, please. We're talking about the nature of religion as a human construction. Mm-hmm. A human construction. We all agree upon that. The question is, what kind of human construction is it? Is it a mind virus, as Richard Dawkins would like to say, a parasite that we just like to cure ourselves of? Or is it good in some sense? Is there some sense in which it's good for the group? And of course a group is just a group. Of course there's between group competition. Come on, please. I mean, you can't live in this world without acknowledging things like that. So the skepticism is as to whether a religion can be a good in something, a social construction which evolved not as a byproduct, not as a cultural parasite, but as an adaptation and as a group level adaptation, which, by the way, is essentially what Emile Durkheim said way back in the beginning of the study of religion. His famous definition of religion as basically a set of beliefs and practices which unite a community into a moral community. This is neo-Durkheimian, and by the way, is just true. One of the tragedies is that the new atheists, trading on their reputations as scientists and evolutionists, people like Dawkins and Dennett, have not taken part in the scholarly study of religion. And it's just plain to see. Just look at their citations. Just plain to see that they mouth off on the nature of religion. They don't even bother to read what their colleagues are doing, much less join them in what they're doing. And those people have reached the conclusion, it is now a consensus, that for the most part, not just religions, but all cultural meaning systems, and here we're going to segue from religion to meaning systems, are impressively adapted at the group level. Group selection, and especially cultural group selection, is huge in human evolution. And part of the denial of religion includes the denial of group selection. These guys can't bring themselves to accept group selection, even outside the context of religion. So So there you have it, science denial among the atheists. And Jonathan Haidt, one of my most valued colleagues, said something wise. He said, if you want to find science denial in anyone, just find what's sacred to them. Just find what's sacred to them, and then you will find science denial. For conservatives, it might be evolution and climate change. For progressives, it might be sex differences and racial differences. For the new atheists, it is the possibility that religions as a human construction might be good, and that then they themselves are a tribe, as you notice, and they themselves have their adaptive fiction. All meaning systems, for all meaning systems, there's a trade-off between beliefs that are true in the scientific sense and beliefs that are useful. And so if what worries us about religion is in believing stuff that's not out there, then that problem extends way beyond religions. All meaning systems have to manage this trade-off between what's actually true in a scientific sense and what's useful. And of course they're designed to be useful. And we should want them to be designed to be useful. Who wants a meaning system that doesn't actually cause behaviors that are sustainable behaviors? So the great challenge is to create a meaning system which is, in the first place, useful, and in the second place, is fully respectful of scientific knowledge. That's what we should be reaching for. And what probably all atheists, including the new atheists, would agree with that. But there's a long way to go.
Mm-hmm. Yes, and as you said, unfortunately, this is a very complex topic, and we would probably have to take another hour just to talk about religion here. And
let me break in. I don't think it's complex. I think the reason we call it complex is because we're so threatened by it. And I mean, the reason that we call something sacred, and the reason that we don't question it, is because it is so vital for our meaning systems. If we were to threaten it, then we would fall apart in some sense, because we rely on our meaning systems in the same way that we rely upon our genes. And you don't just mess with your genes, that would be stupid. Well, you don't mess with your meaning systems either. That would be stupid in terms of causing you and your societies to fall apart. You got to be careful about that. So there's a good reason why we become science denying when we for those things that we hold separate. That's why it's difficult, not because it's intellectually difficult. Intellectually, it is simple, and once you get it, and once you actually have a meaning system which has managed to function well in terms of how it causes you to behave, and is fully accepting of such things as group selection or religions as adaptive at the group level, intellectually, actually it's more simple because things fall together like a big jigsaw puzzle. So it's not intellectually difficult, it's just threatening. That's what makes it intellectually difficult.
Mm-hmm. Yes, it's more simple to explain that way, but perhaps I was using the word complex in terms of instead of being simple-minded about religion, there are several different aspects of religion as a natural phenomenon that we really have to analyze in order to understand it properly.
And that's true. And if you look at fundamentalist meaning systems of all kinds, what you find is that they're simple in the way that you just described. What they describe a world in which everything is either a win-win or a lose-lose situation. Do this and everything will be good. Do that and everything will be bad. And that is a meaning system where when you enter it, then you just have a path to glory. You get up, you run in that direction, and it goes that way. And I've written on this, especially Ayn Rand, the old new atheist, the new atheist of the 1950s. Her meaning system has that linear quality. Do this and everything will be good. Do that and everything will be bad. It's fundamentalist that way, and you can prove it. So I think that, and of course that meaning system is still at large with neoliberal economics and so on. Her influence is still huge. You could tell the same story for the new atheists. It's a form of fundamentalism, and you can prove it.
Mm-hmm. Yes, you can, and I think that you've done a great job with that in your articles, as I referred to. Anyway, just because we have to try to keep this under 1 hour, just one, just one last question. And since you also, in your answer about religion, you referred to group selection, I would like to ask you. How do you think about group selection? Do you think about it as operating only at the cultural level or also at the genetic level?
A short answer, both, for sure. And this is overwhelming. Multilevel selection theory is so foundational to so many topics. Just in biology, forget about humans. It's needed everywhere, including the concept of major evolutionary transitions, the nature of cancer, you name it. I mean, it is just completely essential for the study of non-human species. Then when we get to humans, not only is cultural group selection important, but you cannot tell the story of human evolution, especially at the scale of small-scale societies, our egalitarianism, our ability to cooperate, to have norms, to enforce norms, all these things that actually everyone talks about. Group selection, multi-level selection is required. Why? Here's the simple litmus test that anybody can apply. Whatever your story is about the evolution of our cooperative abilities, whatever traits are required for that, norms, punishment, empathy, sympathy, any of that. Just imagine a single group, a single small group with individuals that differ in those respects, and then ask which traits are most successful within that group, which traits maximize relative fitness within that group. And that is why Darwin was forced to confront group selection. Group selection is actually an addendum of Darwin's theory of natural selection. I've just covered this in an interview like you're interviewing me. I interviewed Elliot Sober, and that interview is now on the internet. Let's link to it. But here's the thing everyone should know. It only takes a minute. At first, Darwin thought that his theory could explain all examples of design that had been attributed to a creator. Then he came to realize that he could not explain morally virtuous behaviors. Everything that's regarded as morally virtuous, such as altruism, loyalty, bravery, honesty, all of these things. If you imagine the morally virtuous individual compared to less virtuous individuals within the same social group, it's the less virtuous individuals that have the advantage. Selfishness beats altruism within single groups. And so therefore, he was forced to invent group selection in order to explain this very important category of behaviors. He didn't need math. Math has nothing to do with it. This was something that he needed to complete his theory of natural selection. And we need it just as much today.
Mm-hmm. Okay, very well. So, Dr. Sloan Wilson, we really have to go to keep this under 1 hour. So, just before we do that, what would you say are some of the best online sources if people want to get in touch with more of your work?
A lot of my work appears online on my online magazine, This View of Life. That is the Evolution Institute's online magazine. Also for economics, evo-nomics.com. So those are the best online resources. There is a website for the Extended Evolutionary Synthesis that is maintained by Kevin Lalande and his colleagues. And so those are the best online resources. And my next book is titled This View of Life, Completing the Darwinian Revolution. It will be published in February.
Okay, very well. So I will be linking to all of that in the description box of this video. And again, Dr. Sloan Wilson, it was really a pleasure to have you on the show. And maybe perhaps someday we could do another conversation just to talk specifically about religion and a little bit more about group selection.
That would be fine. And thank you very much.
Hi everybody, thank you a lot for watching this interview until the end, and also, by the way, for coming to my channel. As you might have noticed, I've started this channel in February 2018 and have been putting out regular interviews with academics and intellectuals from a variety of fields. To keep this channel sustainable, I would like to ask you to please visit my Patreon page and to consider making a pledge. Any amount, even if just $1, would already be a great help. Otherwise, and if you like what I'm doing, please share it, leave a like and hit the subscription button. I would also like to give a huge thank you to my patrons Karen Litzke, Anne Blanchett, Per Helga Larsen, Lau Guerrero, Chantel Gelina, Jim Frank, Francis Ford and Hans Frederick Sunda. Thank you for all.